the Grow Your Own webinar series in collaboration with the Greater Sudbury Public Library and Sudbury Shared Harvest. So this week is National Pollinator Week. So we're celebrating this by talking about pollinator spaces and how to protect them. So in this webinar, we'll visit a couple gardens, and then also we'll have Jennifer Babin-Fenske joining us, giving us a presentation on insects afterwards. So stay tuned for that. And also, if you have any questions, leave them down in the chat and she'll hopefully get to answer them after her presentation. So in Sudbury, we're celebrating this week by trying to encourage the community to grow pollinator gardens. So there's a lot of great resources on the Community Garden Network's website about plant information, how to plant a garden, and so I really recommend going there. And then also we're encouraging folks to take pictures of their gardens and also fill in a survey on the website so that we can add your pictures and garden to a virtual map so that other members of the community can go there and admire all of your hard work. So today I'm here at Delki Dozy to give a visual representation of a few things that you might need to think about when growing a pollinator garden. So the first thing is, well, for example here, I'll point out the lupins. So here you can see they were blooming, they were in full bloom about a week or two ago, but now they are going to seed already. But then you can also see now there are plenty of daisies blooming. So as you can see, the daisies are in bloom. We also have some comfrey flowers, which the bees are loving. Let's see here. There's also some other flowers that are in bloom here. A lot of these wild purple vetch. So we didn't plant these flowers. These came up all on their own. And we also have some yellow indigo over here. So these are all providing pollen to the bees now. And so it's really great that we were able to leave the wildflowers, but also plant flowers so that, you know, if you only planted lupins, then your pollinators only have food really for a few weeks or a month during spring. But if you allow other plants to grow, so maybe wild daisies, or if you plant other native species like the yellow indigo or purple poppy mallow, which will bloom soon. Also, you can see here the milkweed is about to bloom. So that's a great source of pollen for insects and bees and butterflies too. So yeah, variety is really important, and also different colored flowers will attract different types of insects and pollinators, so that's good to consider too. And then another thing to consider when you're buying plants or when you're choosing to plant different things in your garden is to find out if they're native or not to our region. So for example, the milkweed is a really important source of food for monarch caterpillars. So without milkweed, they wouldn't have any food to grow big into a butterfly. So it's really important to plant those species of plants for specific types of insects and pollinators so that they can help pollinate our plants and our fruit trees and shrubs as well. And also the same thing goes for the lupins. So over here we don't have native lupins, although the native type of lupin is really beneficial and important for the Carner's blue butterfly. So it's its only source of food, the same thing as the monarchs. So if you have a choice between the native lupin or the non-native, I would suggest getting the native kind if you can. Another great way to incorporate more wildflowers into your landscape is to not mow and let them grow. So I'll walk around the edible forest garden to let you see what that looks like. So here we have some clover, which is a great ground cover, but if you mow it too often, then the flowers won't bloom. Over here we have a great variety of wild plants. So we have the daisies again. I believe these are asters, some other flowers, and also lots of this purple vetch. So it is quite vigorous and it spreads a lot, and maybe that's not something you'd want in your garden, but if you can dedicate a small area of your yard to a wild flower garden and mow the rest, then that's already doing more for the pollinators. So I encourage you to do that, and then you'll have, you know, a great variety of flowers. We have some, you know, some purple ones, some pink ones, white and yellow. So that's great for different types of pollinators. And so now we're gonna go to Twin Forks to show you what a newly planted pollinator garden looks like. Follow me. So here we are at the Twin Forks Edible Forest Garden. And so here you can see two different kinds of milkweed growing. We have the common and then the swamp. And so these have been planted here, but now they're just growing naturally and spreading a lot, which is great for the monarch caterpillars. And so now we're gonna show you the newly planted pollinator garden. So if you saw our latest webinar about lasagna gardening, you can see that that's what we did here. We laid down cardboard and then we added soil. And so what we have planted here are a lot of native and then some non-native, but all perennial wildflowers, meaning they'll come up every year and you don't need to take care of them too much. And a lot of these will spread on their own too, so it might look kind of empty now, but over time this will fill up with lots of flowers, and actually we're hoping that it'll spread kind of around. So we've added some chives here. They have some nice little flowers. And then we have flowers like black-eyed Susans, purple poppy mallow in here, some more milkweed. We have some small yarrow as well. And we've also got some bee balm and echinacea. And then over on this corner, we've saved some lupins from someone's yard. So the lupins are not native, but because they do flower, they're one of the first to flower in the spring. It's still very beneficial for the bees. So we have a few of those there. And so yeah, it can be as simple or complicated as you want it to be. There's lots of information on the Community Garden Network website, so that if you really want something well designed and pretty and to your liking, then there's lots of resources there where you can learn a lot about different native pollinator plants. But also it can be as easy as just not mowing an area of your lawn and just letting the wildflowers grow there. So I hope you enjoyed this portion of the webinar, and I wish you a happy pollinator week.
Thank you very much. And that video from Sudbury Shared Harvest and Chanel was awesome, because now I'll be talking about insects, and I'll be reiterating some of the things that they talked about. And even they mentioned some of the flowers and some of the tips that I'll be saying, which is awesome, because the more we reiterate what's good for insects, we'll have some great pollinator gardens in Greater Sudbury. So my name's Dr. Jennifer Babin-Fenske. I'm the coordinator of Earth Care Sudbury initiatives with the City of Greater Sudbury. And today I'll be talking about insects. My background is entomology, so I have quite a passion for insects, and I like to share some of the knowledge to help give some tips. Let's see, so I'm going to share my presentation. Let's see, did that not work? There we go. And so what I'd like to start with is geological timescale. And why is this not moving to the next slide? Let's see. Nope. We'll try that again. There we go. So on the geological timescale, insects evolved around 400 million years ago. And while plants evolved a little bit earlier, they were mostly wind-pollinated plants like ferns and conifers. So once flowering plants evolved, insects and plants developed a very interesting and sometimes intimate relationship. With over 100 million years to co-evolve, some insects and plants cannot survive without the other, as there are plants that cannot reproduce without insects, and they require insects for pollination. So now, very quickly, briefly, pollination is how plants reproduce. Pollen is made of tiny cells that are kind of equivalent to our sperm. They're the male reproductive cells. The pollen cells have to reach the female ovary to fertilize egg cells and make an embryo. If you think of animals like a chicken, there's a protective covering around the egg, around the embryo. And in plants, there's a protective covering like a seed shell, but many are further protected and dispersed by surrounding flesh, which makes up our fruits and vegetables. So only 10 to 25% of plants rely on wind pollination. And those plants are mainly things like coniferous trees. Their pollen is so tiny, it travels through the air to other trees. Many of our northern deciduous trees, like birch, are also wind pollinated, which many of us recognize during the spring pollen season in Greater Sudbury. So that means 75 to 90% of plants use animals in some way to help for pollination. Of the animals that pollinate plants, insects are by far the most important pollinators. So there's other animals like fruit bats down in more tropical areas. And when you talk about birds, we often think of hummingbirds. So very quickly for hummingbirds in our area, they love red, long, tubular flowers. If you plant things like bee balm, which Chanel had mentioned, cardinal flower, bleeding hearts, columbine, they should visit the garden regularly. So back to insects. 80% of crops are pollinated by insects. So some people say if you look at your plate at dinner time, 3/4 of the plate was pollinated by insects. But if you think of it, even cows are fed by plants that are often pollinated by insects, especially if you think of clover. So insects are responsible for billions of dollars of products in Canada. Now, we know that these plants rely on insects, but for this relationship to last, insects must be getting something out of it as well for the mutualism. So here are some reasons that insects visit plants. Food is the main attractant. They may eat the nectar, which is very high sugar content. Nectar itself is believed to have evolved simply as an attractant for pollinators and other animal mutualists, which meaning they benefit from each other. Insects could also eat the pollen itself, and pollen is very high in protein and sugar, starch, fat, and other nutrients. Some predators visit and pollinate flowers while they're looking for prey. And some, if you look at the top right, the orchid mantis, they've actually adapted to look just like the predator, to be ambush predators. They look just like the flower to be ambush predators. And then another way, some insects are actually tricked into pollination by thinking they found a mate, and that's called pseudocopulation. There are a number of orchids, for example, that use this strategy. And this is where the flower looks like a female insect and the males approach it to try to mate. So while they're trying to mate, their bodies come in contact with the pollen and they transport it to the other plant. So on the bottom left, you see an example of one of the orchids. The orchid itself is that fuzzy green and brown striped part on the bottom, and that's a male bee thinking it's a female bee. So yes, number of ways that they can attract insects for the pollination. Now, depending on the insects, plants have evolved different patterns, shapes, and strategies to attract them. So we as gardeners can try to understand which flowers attract different insects and help bring a diversity of pollinators to the property. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the types of flowers and types of insects that might come to them. I'll start with beetles. Around here, some of the beetle pollinators are metallic wood-boring beetles, longhorn beetles, flower beetles or bee beetles, and tumbling flower beetles. So beetles often like flowers that are white or dull. They could be strong smelling or bowl-shaped. So many beetles are also attracted to dead and decaying organic matter, and some of them will be attracted to strong smelling flowers. So examples of these are, so the large solitary bowl-shaped, if you think of pond lilies. And again, if you think of a lot of beetles, they're quite a bulky, heavy insect, so having a bowl-shaped, sturdy flower works for them very well. Cluster flowers can also attract different beetles like goldenrods, and the strong smelling flowers I mentioned, like wild ginger. So this photo shows how some insects have pubescence, which is like a fur, to help them carry pollen from one plant to another. And I like this insect because it shows how goldenrods can be attractive to many different pollinators. There's actually two beetles there doing something else, but there's a beetle there and a bee as well. And this one shows some of the tiny beetles we have in the area, and these ones are called tumbling flower beetles. Now for flies, some of our fly pollinators include hoverflies here on the left. They're often mistaken for wasps. You can see that they're yellow and black stripes, but they're very cigar shaped, and you'll see them hovering over the flowers as if they're just still. But flies, they have different antennae, different eyes. They don't have the small waist, the skinny waist like wasps and bees do. And flies have only 2 wings, where most of the other insects you'll see, like bees and wasps, will have 4 wings. The other one on the right is a blowfly or bottlefly. And so flies don't necessarily need showy flowers because they like strong smelling flowers, either frankly malodorous or sweet smelling. So some examples are daisies, red trillium, buttercups, and Queen Anne's lace. So this is a daisy. Some of you may have been fooled by some of the daisies that we have, where when I was a child, I collected a nice little bouquet for my mom and then took a big sniff, and it smells like rotting feet. So you may recognize the fly on the right as the green bottle fly, or the type of fly you find on dog feces and dead animals. So yes, the daisy does smell quite stinky, and these are the type of flies that it can attract. I also wanted to point out that there's another little pollinator on the flower, and that's a tiny wasp. So when we talk about bee and wasp pollinators, remember there are hundreds of species in Greater Sudbury, and things like this tiny wasp are important as well, just as important as the showy bumblebees and the hoverflies. And of course, many species of wasps don't sting, and this is one of them. It's quite tiny. Now for moths and butterflies, we have things like painted ladies, white admiral, mourning cloak, and monarchs. This is a picture of a sedum with both the white admiral and bumblebee feeding on it, again showing how you can have a variety of pollinators going to different flowers. So for many flowers, moths and butterflies are anti-pollinators. They cheat. They have long legs and very long proboscis, so they can stand on a flower and drink the nectar without coming in contact with pollen at all. So some flowers have adapted to attract moths and butterflies specifically while trying to get them in contact with the pollen. So some flowers that have co-evolved are sweet smelling and tubular. So for moth flowers, they're typically light colored, pendant, meaning they hang down, with nocturnal anthesis, which means some of them actually open the flower opens in the evening or at night. Butterfly flowers tend to be more colorful, red, yellow, blue, different colors, upright with diurnal anthesis. So the flower opens during the day. So with these 2 photos, you can see the difference in how moths and butterflies feed. So this clear-winged moth, again, it's often confused for a bee. We do have clear-winged moths in Greater Sudbury. You can see how it hovers, and that's why the pendulum The pendulent flowers are very, very good for them. And the butterflies, again, you can see how they tend to like to perch on top of the flowers. Now for bees, they're considered the world's most important pollinators. There's over 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and all visit flowers. So flowers that attract bees are often bright yellow or blue, sweet smelling, and have nectar guides. Nectar guides are lines on the petals that can direct pollinators to the nectar. So they land on the flat flower and it's like a little guideline to where the nectar is. They can be visible with the naked eye, but bees do see ultraviolet. So some of the flowers actually have nectar guides that can only be seen in ultraviolet light, as shown in the pictures on the right. So bees don't sting. Sorry, woo, yes they do. Male bees don't sting because the stinger of the bee is actually the modified reproductive organ of females. It's their ovipositor, which is the long tube for laying eggs. Many insects have them, but for bees and wasps, they've been modified, hardened into a stinger, and they've evolved a whole poison apparatus on the inside. But yes, male bees do not sting. Social bees, and social bees are like honeybees. Social means they live in colonies and things like that. So they will sting to protect their nest. So they're more aggressive if the nest is more nearby, but they still often don't sting when they're out feeding in gardens. And then solitary bees, think of bumblebees and things like that. Again, they can sting, but usually if you really have to disturb them, if you step on them and disturb them in some way. So one thing we can do for the pollinators is provide the safe and delicious food, which is what I was just talking about. We've discussed some of the favorite food, but there's also some, kind of anti-pollinator food out there. Wild roses, for example, are great. Again, they're open, they're nice, it's very attractive, it's welcoming for the pollinator. They have a good pollen supply. But if you think of a long stem rose, they've been bred to be closed and actually don't have a lot of nectar. So there's things to think about with the types of flowers. And as Chanel was mentioning in Sudbury Shared Harvest, it's very important to consider blooming times. This is a list of some native plants that have a variety of blooming times. Joe Pyeweed, you often hear, asters, I mentioned goldenrod. But when you look at it in a garden, you can see some of the ways to organize them. This slide was provided to me a few years ago from Northern Wildflowers. It gives a nice example of a pollinator garden that I thought I'd share because it shows, again, it's native plants and when they bloom. They all bloom at different times of the year because you need flowers to bloom right from early spring through until fall. And again, these slides can be available online afterwards. So what else can we do for insects? After the food, insects also need water. Butterflies especially are known for what's called puddling. And that's not just getting the liquid, but it's getting minerals from puddles. So if you have a small bird bath or a small tray of some sort to have water in your garden, you can add sand for the minerals, like natural sand, yeah, like dirt, basically. Have some sand for the minerals, but also some pebbles. They need landing sites because insects can fall in and drown. So pebbles or pieces of sticks and things like that. As you can see with this wasp, it's quite precarious. If that water was a little bit lower, it would be much more difficult for it to drink and it might fall in. We also want to avoid pesticides, which might not be as simple as it sounds. First, remember that eco-friendly pesticides may still harm pollinators and humans. Eco-friendly and all natural can mean a lot of things that people mistakenly think they're safe and not poisonous. I like to use the example of poison ivy. You can market poison ivy. It's all natural, but you don't really want to eat it. So be careful with the labels and try to decipher what they might actually mean if they say something like all natural. It's also very difficult nowadays because some seed distributors and nurseries spray their seeds and plants with pesticides before you purchase them. Many seeds you buy at the retail stores and nurseries have been sprayed with chemicals like neonicotinoids to avoid spider mites and other nursery and house pests. So now some nurseries and seed companies will state on the package, or if you ask them, if they use them or not. So we've provided food and water. We also need habitat. The garden itself will attract pollinators, but where will they nest and where will they lay their eggs? And this is where things like bee boxes come in. So don't worry, some people will be like, oh, you're just attracting bees that will sting. Again, first of all, your garden is what's attracting them. And second, they don't willingly sting when they're out collecting food. And a lot of our native bees and native bees are solitary bees, or and they're not the social bees. So mason bees, for example, you can make mason bee boxes. They're very simple. The bee goes in, lays their eggs, they cover the hole, and the adults emerge in the spring. You also have to look at a variety of other plants for things for the larvae to feed on, and larvae and caterpillars. And another thing to do is avoid black cloth gardens. Many of our pollinators are ground nesting insects like the bumblebees. There are a lot of bees and wasps that burrow into the ground. If you place the black cloth down in your garden, you've basically just removed all possible habitat for those pollinators. And the final message is to avoid or reduce all grass lawns. All grass lawns are considered a monoculture. It's never a good idea to have a monoculture because once you have an insect pest or disease strike, it just spreads. So, and the other thing is grass is not attractive to pollinators, and you've basically just created a desert for them. So planting white clover, which is also drought tolerant, so you don't have to water it like grass, dandelions, and accepting a few devil's paintbrush and hawkweed may not be a bad thing. And so that is the last bit of my presentation. I hope that that gives some tips. I wanted to give this last slide. It's just some of the local groups that are working, that have or are working on pollinator gardens and providing habitat for monarch. So shout out to Junction Creek Stewardship Committee, Conservation Sudbury, the city. So with our Earth Care Minutes, we do have an Earth Care Minute showing how the cities don't mow along the roadsides to help promote biodiversity of wildflowers. Community Garden Network, David Suzuki program, the Butterfly Away project. We do have some residents in Greater Sudbury participating in that. I believe that we've, some of the workshops have discussed that. Sudbury Shared Harvest, thank you very much for having me today. Coalition for Livable Sudbury, Greater Sudbury Food Policy Council, and the Sudbury Horticultural Society. So that is my presentation. It's open for questions. I don't know everything about all insects, but hopefully there are some questions that come through and I'll be able to answer them or guide them to the right answer, the right person.
So Jennifer, it's looking like we do not have any questions at the moment, but thank you very much for being here today on behalf of the Greater Sudbury Public Library, as well as Sudbury Shared Harvest. And I will post, for anyone who's interested, I'll post all the links to the different organizations, websites and whatnot in the comment section of this video. So for anyone who is watching later on and wants to go visit for additional resources, they can do so there. But thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for episode 9, which will be coming up next month. We're going to be looking at composting. So another great episode coming your way. And yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you very much. Happy gardening.